بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل أعوذ برب الناس ملك الناس إله الناس من شر الوسواس الخناس الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين اللهم اجعلنا منهم ومن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر آمين يا رب العالمين. Anyhow, let's get to the surah, the final surah of the series, Surah un-nas. And the first thing we'll talk about is its fundamental relationship between the surah itself and the surah that came before it. The previous surah ends وَمِن شَرِّ حَاسِدٍ إِذَا حَسَدٍ. Last thing Allah says in Surah Al-Falaq, from the evil, from the harm of the one who is jealous, who has hasad, when he acts out in accordance with his hasad. Now you tell me, of all the creations of Allah, which creation is the most jealous? Which creation is the most jealous? The one who intends you the most harm. إِنَّهُ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌّ مُبِينٌ. Iblis, shaitan. The next surah is dedicated to protect you from the one who is the most jealous, min sharril waswasil khannas. Iblis himself, shaitan himself. So there's a logical progression. We asked in the end from the protection from the harm of the one who has jealousy, and we get to the one who is the source of all of that jealousy. Even between human beings, when someone has jealousy, who inspires that jealousy in them? Who comes and puts waswasa in them to have that jealousy to begin with? So we identified the outwardly of the problem in Surah Al-Falaq, but the inwardly source, the ultimate source of that jealousy, Iblis himself, who comes and puts waswasa and says, why is that guy coming up? You need to do something about it. You need to say something. You need to plot something. That's been identified in Surah un-nas. That's the first thing that connects these two surahs. Then of course we talked about how the Surah Al-Falaq is Allah Azza wa Jalla giving us protection from evils and harms that exist outside of ourselves. But Surah un-nas, evils that make their way inside of ourselves, our own nafs, nas themselves, the whispers of people that enter into our hearts, shaitan who is revolving in the chests of the people, inside of the people, fi sudur un-nas. So evils on the outside are guarded against in Surah Al-Falaq, and evils on the inside in Surah un-nas. Another way of looking at it also is, the evils mentioned in Surah Al-Falaq are out of your control. Somebody blowing over knots, casting spells over you, trying to harm you because of jealousy. These are things outside of your control. So you're asking Allah's protection from them. But if you look at Surah un-nas, the things that Allah is talking about, people whispering and giving you suggestions and, putting waswasa in you, whether or not you act on that waswasa, you will not be able to blame the one who whispered it to you. In other words, the liability in the previous surah is on the criminals who are engaged in the act of jealousy, engaged in the act of sorcery, engaged in the harm that they're trying to afflict on you in the darkness of the night. But in this surah, the responsibility will fall on who? Yourself. If you fall trapped to this waswasa, you will not be able to go to shaitan and say, it was your fault, you got me into this. It was your waswasa that made me go to this thing and do that thing or do the other thing, because on the day of judgment he's going to say, La talumuni. Don't you blame me, no, blame yourself. I just sent the email, you're the one who clicked it. I just made the call, you're the one who picked it up. I just sent you the address, you're the one who drove there. I just gave you the invitation. That's all. The one acting on it was you, and in the end, you are the one that is responsible. So in this surah, the greater danger is mentioned, and one of the ways to look at it, once again, the evils mentioned in the previous surah are out of your control. And the evil mentioned in this surah, you are liable for yourself. You will have to answer for them yourself. Yet another way that it's been described by ulama, the relationship between these two, the previous harms what is outwardly, meaning harms your dunya. The hasad can harm someone can harm you with their hasad in your dunya. Magic can harm someone psychologically and things like that. These are things that affect your dunya. But the waswasa of shaitan harms what? Your deen, your akhirah, your iman. So now we have to compare dunya and deen, which is more precious, which has to be guarded more. You see? It's a very clear thing that our deen has to be guarded far more than our dunya. So we asked Allah's protection a lot more in Surah un-nas. We only called on Allah once in Surah Al-Falaq. What did we say? قُلْ أَعُوذُ Rabbil Falaq. Rabb came up once. Look at Surah un-nas. We're asking Allah to protect our deen. How many times we call on Allah? Qul a'udhu bi Rabbin nas, Malikin nas, Ilahin nas. 3 times as much. We emphasized the protection of our deen, our iman, because when shaitan makes waswasa in your iman, putting doubts in it, putting jealousy in it, putting evil in it, putting greed in it, what is it attacking? It's attacking the faith, the taqwa. The ihsan that one may possess, it can corrupt all of those things. So we ask Allah a lot more protection in this surah. And so here, like I mentioned, I mentioned this in Richardson, so I'll tell you again here. The one you ask protection from, the one you're asking protection from is called al-musta'adhu bihi. Al-musta'adh bihi. And the one who you are running from, the one you're trying to guard yourself from, the one you're trying to escape, al-musta'adh minhu. So you got 2 terms out. Al-musta'adh bihi, the one you're seeking protection of. Al-musta'adh minhu, the one you're seeking protection from. There's a reciprocal relationship between this surah and the previous. The previous surah mentioned one musta'adh bihi, Rabbil Falaq. And then the rest of the surah was dedicated to several different instances of al-musta'adh minhu, meaning things you're running from, things you want to get away from. Min sharri ma khalaq, wa min sharri ghasiqin idha waqab, wa min sharri naffathati fil uqad, wa min sharri hasidin idha hasad. Several musta'adh minhu. Now it's been reversed in this surah. You have several musta'adh bihi. Qul a'udhu bi Rabbin nas, Malikin nas, Ilahin nas. The mention of the one you're seeking protection from is far more. But shar, notice in the previous surah, how many times did shar come up? من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب ومن شر النفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد. Shar, multiple times shar. But here multiple times Rabb, but how many times shar? How many musta'adh minhu? 1 actually. من شر الوسواس الخناس. And the rest of it is just an explanation of that ayah. If you look at الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس, that is all an explanation of that central ayah of al-musta'adh minhu min sharril waswasil khannas. So there's this reciprocity between these 2 surahs. So now we're going to look at how Allah Azza wa Jalla in this surah, He asked us to seek protection, but He used 3 of His names. There are 3 things here. 3 names of Allah are used: Rabbin nas, Malikin nas, Ilahin nas. And then 3 times the word nas is mentioned. For each the mudaf ilayh, the extended to is the word nas. Rabbin nas, Malikin nas, Ilahin nas. In Arabic you could say Qul a'udhu bi Rabbin nas, Malikihim, Ilahihim. You could use a pronoun. You could use dhamir instead. But Allah used nas. So we're going to try to figure out some benefits of this remarkable sequence, inshallah ta'ala, in the next part of this dars. We'll talk first about a psychological progression. A child. For a child, one of the first realizations a child has is that their needs are taken care of by their parent. Someone who has, tarbiyah over them. Someone who takes care of their tarbiyah. When you have a need, you go to your murabbi. Part of the meaning of Rabb is what? Murabbi. It's one of the earliest recognitions you have. You go to someone who has authority over you, especially if in not Islamic history, world history, a slave, when he has a need, where does he go? Even in the human sense, he goes to the master. Or if you have someone who in a rububiyyah ownership is a close relationship. So the first one to turn to, someone who plays the role of owner or authority, or the one who takes care of you, etc. Even a child knows to do that, turn to that entity. That's captured in the word Rabb. But then there's a problem that's bigger than someone individually. Your parent can't take care of that problem. The one who's over you cannot take care of that problem. It's a problem bigger than that. You know who you go to? You go to the government. You go to the king. You go to the sovereign, Malik. You make that next progression. But then you have a problem that's so big that your Murabbi can't solve it, your Sayyid, your Malik, your Mun'im can't solve it, your Malik can't solve it, your king, government can't solve it. No one on earth can solve it. Where do people turn to when they have that need? They turn to God. Ilahin nas. The one that's to be, you can only ask God for help now. Right? Ilahin nas. There's this progression. There's a psychological progression. Now, as we're talking about psychological progression, it seems like what most people do, they first turn to 2 creations in dunya. They turn to their parents, or the owner, or the boss, or the employee. Somebody who can help them in their immediate sense, captured inside the word Rabb. Then they turn to a higher authority, captured in what word? Malik. And when all fails, now you put it in the hands of Allah. But Allah is teaching you, from the very beginning, where do you go? From the very beginning, your Rabb is Allah, your Malik is Allah, your Ilah is Allah. From the very beginning. And this is the height of intellectual progression. There's psychological progression and there's intellectual progression. The height of intellectual progression, which is manifest in the Quran in people like Ibrahim alayhi salam, is that you understand that from your most basic needs to your greatest needs, you turn for everything to Allah. You turn for everything to Allah. Allah Azza wa Jal musabbibul asbab. Nothing will happen without His will. For every one of my needs, I need to turn back to Him. فَهُوَ رَبِّي وَمَلِكِي وَإِلَهِي. So قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ مَلِكِ النَّاسِ and إِلَهِ النَّاسِ. Then, I'm going to look at this from a literary point of view. Dr. Fadl Salih Hassan al-Ra'i said something really beautiful about this surah, so we'll look at it in Arabic and I'll translate it for you. وَقَدْ تَدَرَّجَتِ الْآيَاتِ مِنَ الْكَثْرَةِ إِلَى الْقِلَّةِ. The ayat progress from more to less, from maximum to minimum. What does he mean by that? فالرب هو المرشد الموجه وقد يكون هناك العديد من المرشدين والمربيين. Rabb, part of the meaning of Rabb is the one who takes care of you, the one who sets you right, the one who is concerned for you even. And in the worldly sense, could there be many of those that take care, that are concerned with? You can have many. But then he says, في المجتمع لكن لكل دولة ملك واحد. But for any society, any country, how many kings do you have? How many sovereigns do you have? One. In any society, you can have multiple arbab in the worldly sense, but you will only have one malik. But even then, as the world as a whole, you can have multiple muluk, you can have multiple kings, but even just for one society, one king at a time. But then you go further, وَالدُّنْيَا فِيهَا مُلُوكٌ كَثُرٌ وَلَكِنَّ الْإِلَهُ وَاحِدٌ. Finally, you come to ilah, and how many ilah can you have? Only one. The word ilah can never be taken in a worldly sense. The word Rabb you can take in a worldly sense. Rabbul Bayt, right? Rabbu Abdik, you could do that. Actually, even in Tafseer Surah Yusuf, Innahu Rabbi Ahsana Mathwaya, right? When he called on his master, one of the tafseers of that is that Yusuf a.s. was not talking when he was seeking refuge of Allah, then he was talking about how he's not going to be ungrateful to his master who took care of him, may even be referring to the Aziz, the word Rabb. And it has worldly implications too. Malik can have worldly implications. But Malik can have, the king can have worldly implications. But the word ilah can only have one implication, and that is Allah Azza wa Jal. Innama ilahukum ilahun wahid. That can only be one. So it's a progression from more to less. But then as far as the word nas is concerned, it's less to more. Think about this. When there is someone who takes care, he can only, in the worldly sense, he only takes care of a few. What about a king? Does he take care of more than a few? He's got more under him, more people under him. What about an ilah? Does he take care of more than a few? Now it's everybody. So where the word Rabb, the words for Allah are going from kathra to qillah. They're going from more to less. But the implications of the word nas are going from less to more. They're reversing, subhanallah. So that's why the word nas each time actually has a slightly different meaning. The repetition isn't just there for beautification or because it rhymes. Rabbun nas is more, it's a lesser group. Malikin nas is larger, and then the most comprehensive group is what? Ilahin nas. Ilahin nas. So there's this incredible progression and this eloquence inside these ayat. Then another point of notice about something of an overview of Quran really, which we'll do more of at the end of this dars. But the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal commands us, فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنِ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. Whenever you recite Quran, you should be seeking refuge of Allah from shaitan. So the Quran's recitation begins with seeking refuge. And the Quran itself ends also with seeking refuge. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ. Beginning and ending, we see the need for seeking Allah's protection from this incredible waswasa. And we'll see the importance of that inshallah ta'ala very, very soon. Now, who is the biggest victim of shaitan? In the Quran, a lot of bad people are mentioned. But after shaitan, who would you put at number 2? Fir'aun. You would put Fir'aun at number 2. And I want you to note something about Fir'aun. And actually, before you know something about Fir'aun, I want you to note something about this surah. Remind yourself once again, what 3 names of Allah did we find? Rabbin Nas, Malikin Nas, Ilahin Nas. I'll tell you 3 things Allah says about Fir'aun. 1. فَقَالَ أَنَا رَبُّكُمُ الْأَعْلَى. What did he say about himself? I am Rabb. The biggest waswasa of shaitan, what you're supposed to attribute to Allah, he attributed to himself. Rabb. Listen to another ayah from Fir'aun. أَلَيْسَ لِي مُلْكُ مِصْرَ, pertaining to Fir'aun rather. أَلَيْسَ لِي مُلْكُ مِصْرَ وَهَذِهِ الْأَنْهَارُ تَجْرِي مِنْ تَحْتِي. Don't I own the kingdom of Misr? Don't these rivers flow beneath, and only I am the king of Misr? What's he referring to himself as? Malik. That's what he's referring himself. So he mentioned himself as Rabb, then he mentioned himself as Malik. What's left? Ilah. So let's see if he committed this crime too. He turns to his chiefs and he says, وَقَالَ فِرْعَوْنَ يَا أَيُّهَا الْمَلَأ مَا عَلِمْتُ لَكُم مِّنْ إِلَٰهٍ غَيْرِي. My generals, listen up. I don't know of any other ilah for you other than myself. For Fir'aun, we find himself declaring three things for himself: Rububiyyah, Mulk, and Uluhiyyah. All three for himself. Rabb, Malik, Ilah. We find this sampling that Allah has given us in the Quran is very important. It shouldn't be overlooked. And it's not just for you and I to say, oh man, Fir'aun, la'anahullah, what a loser. But there's something here. That is what the waswasa of shaitan can lead to. What was the biggest problem of shaitan? Shaitan himself, what was his biggest problem? Arrogance. Arrogance. What is the biggest thing he can instill inside a human being? Arrogance. And what is the worst manifestation of arrogance? Fir'aun. But you don't have to reach Fir'aun to be worried that you're headed down the same road that leads to Fir'aun. Today we are not living in a time where people declare themselves gods over others. But we are living in times where people declare themselves gods over themselves. They declare themselves their own master. I am my own man. I am my own master. They declare themselves their own king. King of the house. King of my territory. King of my domain. They declare themselves their own ilah. Their own hawa, their own desires become their ilah. أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Did you see the one who takes his desires and turns them into his ilah? Even. We're living in times where we can each turn into mini Fir'aun without even realizing it. We don't have to have large castles and fight with messengers and be arrogant, outspoken against Allah Azza wa Jal. But that concept of ego that is crushed in the beginning of this surah by you openly saying, I need protection. I need Allah's protection. I'm coming into His obedience. There's a very powerful lesson in this. Very, very powerful lesson. Iblis himself recognizes the lordship of Allah but wants the human being to forget it. He himself said, you are the one who created, khalaqtani. Even when he was disobeying Allah, he gave him credit. Khalaqtani min nar. You created me from fire. Even then he acknowledged Tawheed himself. Even he himself. But he wants the human being to forget that Tawheed. He wants the human being to become ungrateful. May Allah protect us from the waswasa of shaitan. Then the other thing here that's really just absolutely remarkable is the relationship between the word nas, and this has come up in a long dars before, but I'm repeating it. The word nas has several meanings, but one of its root origins actually comes from nisyan, forgetfulness. Forgetfulness. Nas, one of the reasons human beings are called nas is because they are forgetful. And Al-Farra even went as far as to say it is because they forgot the promise they had made to Allah. You know which promise? أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ قَالُوا بَلَا شَهِدْنَا. Am I not your master? Allah said, am I not your Rabb? Even then he introduced himself as what? Rabb. And we said, yes, of course we testify. But we come to this world and we forget. One of the only powers Allah has given shaitan is the ability to make people forget. And what's the biggest thing people forget? That Allah is their master. I don't mean you forget it for life, you have amnesia, you don't remember it again. But for those 5 minutes when you were acting out your aggression, you forgot. For that day, for that weekend, you forgot. When you took that turn, you forgot. When you raised your eyes and looked, at that moment you forgot that you have a master. He can make you forget at the right moment. Now listen to this ayah. استحوذ عليهم الشيطان فأنساهم ذكر الله. Shaitan got a hold of them and made them forget the remembrance of Allah. The word nas that's used. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ. The master of the people who have a tendency to what? Forget. And when they forget, whose waswasa is it that makes them forget? Shaitan. So we seek protection, not becoming forgetful. Part of the lesson of this surah is don't be forgetful. We are asking Allah to be people of remembrance and not people of heedlessness. Similarly, Allah reminds us, وَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. When you recite Qur'an, seek Allah's refuge, because you know what's going to happen? You will forget what you're reciting. Has that ever happened to you? You're reciting, but you're on a different planet already. The salat is going on, and you change the channel. You're on a different frequency at that point. You have no idea what's going on. You forgot where you are. People forget what rak'ah they're in. People forget. They forget. Whenever you recite Qur'an, seek Allah's refuge. فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. Even in Surah Al-Kahf, this lesson was mentioned in passing. You know how the servant of Musa alayhi salam forgot to tell him? He says, وَمَا أَنْسَانِيهُ إِلَّا الشَّيْطَانُ أَنْ أَذْكُرَهُ. No one except shaitan made me forget. I forgot to mention it. Whose fault? Shaitan made me forget. Shaitan made me forget. We will come to a narration inshallah ta'ala about this, which is narrated by several Sahaba about forgetfulness and the relationship between forgetfulness and the control of shaitan. But inshallah when the time comes. But learn from this, one of the greatest refuges from the waswas of shaitan is the remembrance of Allah. Because you have one of two things. Forgetfulness and getting caught with shaitan is the same now. And remembering Allah and being protected from shaitan is also the same. If the heart is filled with Allah's remembrance, shaitan's got no room to get in. When the heart is emptied from Allah's remembrance, there's this empty vacancy. There's a big sign out now, vacancy available, and shaitan goes in. The only way he can go in is when you are not remembering Allah. When you're not remembering. It's a very simple image that is going to be painted in this surah.